I want to start in generally with the caveat that I would say of everything I've taught, this has been this is the deepest dive I've ever done into Islam, and again, I feel like I'm just scratching the surface. So much of what's there has similarities and differences, and I haven't studied it enough to understand why. I've read various things, and anyone who's ever done a PhD, when they say they've read books, that doesn't mean they actually read them. It means they just sort of diced them and sliced them and read a lot of book reviews until they understood what it meant, and then they call that reading. But I wanted to make some things available to you that I have read, some of them bet more than others, and you're welcome to either take a picture of them and purchase them, or you're just welcome to borrow them. But if you do borrow them, I want to take a picture of you with the book so I know who takes my books. No, trust me, I've lost many a book. When I was packing to move here, I was going through my library, and I'm like, where's this book? Where's this book? But it was right at the beginning of COVID, so no one was in the office. So I didn't know who had them, nor could I find out, nor could they get them. So I'm sure people have absconded with my books. Here's the Quran. This is their holy text. That's the English spelling. In most texts, the transliteration is a Quran. But if you would like to look at it, it is very similar to the scriptures. And we'll talk a little bit about that, but in terms of its language, in terms of it's what it's referencing, there's a lot of overlap there. In fact, I've been in services where people read from the Quran just to mess with people, and then they said at the end, they said this was from so-and-so, the Quran, and then, I think they're trying to prove a point. They probably did, but to each its own. We've talked the last few weeks about Abrahamic faiths, and this is a book that is narrative based. It's more, if you like narrative journalism, I have read a fair amount of this. It reads like a novel or exploratory journalism. And it's basically someone looking at the three different faiths and sort of goes to sites and engages with the people and talk. And so it's journalism in an interesting form. Muslims and Christians at the table. It says promoting a biblical understanding among North American Muslims. This is probably the of these books, if you want to read in terms of the comparative nature of Christianity and Islam. This is great because it does it from both the positive and negative side in general. Right now, this is a phenomenal book. And if you are interested in general about what's happening in the religious life of North America, Eboo Patel is a author and speaker, and he runs something called Interfaith Youth Corps. We worked with them in the Presbyterian Church, did a lot of interfaith work with our Presbyterian schools or undergraduate institutions. And he was a speaker for that and got to know him there. He is phenomenal. In fact, I think anyone who ever meets Eboo who had any sort of Islamic phobia or negative perceptions to be dispelled, because he's just so open, and he is devout in his faith, which we will talk about as being an aspect of Islam in general. And this is another Presbyterian pastor. This was published by the Presbyterian Publishing House, but it's his exploration into Islam. Narrative based, also I would put that in the category of that. So and then the last one that you can't take and you can't borrow, because I found it interesting, this is called God Is Not One, and it's an argument against the idea that every faith is pursuing the same God, that there are exclusions, and that faiths have difference. And I think in the back it says Islam addresses the problem of pride, and the solution is submission, which is actually what the word Islam means, submission to God. Christianity, the problem is sin, the solution is salvation. Buddhism, the problem is suffering, the solution is awakening. And Judaism, the problem is exile, the solution is a return to God. If you're looking for something, this covers 8 religions, several of which I don't think we're going to cover all of them. Taoism, I don't think we will, but most of them that are in here we will cover in some form. But if you're looking for an interesting read that kind of breaks it down, I have enjoyed digging into this, so you can't borrow it right now. So I'll leave these up here after if you want to talk about or remind what they are, or borrow any of the other ones, just have to take a picture with it and you can, and that's, let me admit someone here. So that is my literature review. I will say, I started to say that earlier, my caveat with this as well is that this is probably, I've studied more Hinduism, I studied more Buddhism, obviously I've studied Judaism, but this in terms of like, when you start getting in other languages and it's in Arabic and it gets a little, that's when it gets a little dicey. So, and I actually went to and I listened to several presentations on YouTube just of like, you know, Islam in 10 minutes, and I found them all very unhelpful. I mean, like by the time I was done, I was like, what did they just say? And part of it is the terminology that is that is used in terms of what Islam is Arabic.
Is what?
Arabic. But when you have a language that you're not used to, I mean, I wrote down more terms than I possibly could write, and I don't know if I should even say them or not because they won't mean anything to you. So what I'm going to do is try to translate some of those terms. I will use some of the main ones that they use or some of the ones that you might encounter if you were reading about it in general, but not that it's going to stick. And I wouldn't even worry about trying to make it stick. What we're going to try to do is look at the general categories of their of how they came into being. Some of the way they conceptualize things like God, the afterlife, creation, prophets. They have 5 pillars of practices that they do. And then they also have a series of, what do they call, the 6 articles of belief that they hold to, and we'll cover those. So what you're going to get is a little bit generally about Islam as a religion, a brief overview of the history, the main tenets. We'll run it through the whole schema at the end just to make sure we cover everything of those categories of experience, sacrifice, sacrament, and there are a few interesting things in there. Before we begin, though, I would say I, in general, have a much greater appreciation for Islam as an Abrahamic religion. I mean, in the sense of, not in the sense of I would ascribe to holding it as being true, but it contains the same truths that we hold to. And some people would call that syncretism, that one borrowed from the other. And the fact that Islam really wasn't even founded until the 7th century means that this is 600 and some years. I don't know, 610, I think he had his first revelation around there. That's 600 years after Christ. Christians had already established, again, as we learned on Sunday, the Holy Roman Empire had already been spread. And the fall of Rome had happened. And this is at a time, not surprisingly, if you were there on Sunday, and I talked about the transition to Gregory the Great, where after the fall of Rome in the Dark Ages, that Gregory the Great reinstituted Benedictine spirituality as the primary spiritual expression of all of the Roman Empire. And Islam surfaced at this time. So it's a younger religion, but saying that, it is also the 2nd largest religion in the world and is expected to surpass Christianity by the end of the 21st century. And so Christianity will probably become the 2nd largest. And part of that's expansion. Part of that is their beliefs in life and culture. They believe in the propagation of this of Muslims. And so where birth control has become a norm in Western culture, where Christianity, and in Europe, where Christianity has been primarily seated in the largest numbers, we have birth rates that don't match the Muslims in general. So, yes?
What religion were the people that started following the Islam or created the Islamic religion? What were they prior to that?
All of everything we deal with, and this is where, and because I don't know the Middle East beyond my biblical understanding of how it worked within the ancient Near East in general, but think Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Mecca is in Saudi Arabia, and Medina, they're all in that region of the Middle East. One of the things that I think is interesting is often when we think of Iran or Iraq or the Middle East, or just that region, we automatically assume Muslim, whereas actually a good portion of them are not. You have Hinduism that bleeds from the east. You have Christianity still as being present in many of those places, and some in obviously different times more persecuted than others. But Islam is very heavily located in northern Africa. In fact, what are they are the majority population in 49 countries in the world. 31% of the Muslims, and there are 1.9 billion Muslims in the world, making them the second largest. And Muslim is what they call in the singular. Ummah is what they're called in the plural. So as we say Christian or Christians, they say Muslim and Ummah. Again, you don't really need to know that, but for whatever it's worth. So, 20% Muslims live in the Middle East. So we have this image of, like, you know, anyone who looks Middle Eastern, we kind of, in particular after 9/11, and we will circle around to that at the end, just the notion of what that, not that those from the Middle East, I think they were looked at as, you know, as where oil came from, or where wealthy sheiks and camels came from, and it was just sort of foreign land. And we always knew there was Islamic terrorism, but that should not be associated with the Nation of Islam as a whole. I couldn't be more passionate about that point. In the same way, we have extremist groups in Christianity that go on tangents and often get the most press and do the most damage. And those are the extremists. You know, you have extremists in every religion, and usually extremism or religious extremists come out of a misinterpretation of the text. I have shared, yes, Sharon, I'll remember to remind me to repeat the question, because they can only hear from here. What was the question again? No,
what religion were these people before?
Well, beforehand, yeah. So there is a conglomeration of monotheism in the Middle East. They didn't necessarily come, there are smaller tribal Persian religions. There wasn't a dominant religion. But when you think about where Saudi Arabia is and where Mecca is, you had, in the 7th century, this is so you had Christianity has spread at this point. I mean, you know, Christianity has become in the West, the state religion. Judaism was still thriving at the time, and in the sense of it was, I mean, as much as it ever has, but it was still an active and influential religion in that. Hinduism has not, once Hinduism went east, it largely stayed east. I think it settled as it went, and we don't see a lot of pushing back, but Hinduism is not a proselytization type religion. Neither is Judaism, technically. Judaism is like, well, this is who we are, and God is redeeming the world through them. But both Islam and Christianity are proselytizing religions. And there's a whole separate conversation that we could have around the nature of the spread of religion and the development of the, you know, I mean, comes to mind, the Western Protestant work ethic. We started to equate civilness and citizenship and productivity as signs of excellence that were given by God, and they conflate that. So as industrialization spread, so did Christianity. And so you tie into the development, and even the development of capitalism over the last few centuries has absolute clear ties to the spread of Christianity. And in the same way, we live in a society where people will say, you know, that they want to deny that early Christian influence. And the reality is that we in our world cannot, in the West world, cannot talk about morality without tracing its roots back to Abraham. And at the core of Islam, the call is very similar to Judaism. To worship God, to care for the needy. So let's dig into it. I did go back, 15% are in Africa, which is not that many, but that's the top, and then the rest are just spread throughout the world. The US has a pretty good chunk as well. Just for whatever it's worth, Islam, although in our Western world operates according to the Gregorian calendar and uses BC and AD, probably not anymore. If you're not up to date on world religion studies, only use BCE and BC. So or Common Era. CE is and then you have BCE. So what was before Christ is now before Common Era. And then from 0 or 1000 to the present day, the last 2000 years is considered Common Era, but what we traditionally call it AD, or after the death of, Anno Domini, after the death of our Lord. So even if you change it, though, it's still dating according to Christ's birth in presence. So it doesn't, that's just sort of a wash anyways, but they have their own calendar that begins with the first revelation of Muhammad, which was 610. And so today, if you want to talk about their dating system, it's the year 1444. Oh no, that was not when the first revelation is the flight or the immigration of Muhammad, when he fled from Mecca to Medina in 1622 or 622. So in 622, and we'll get into the history, Muhammad fled from Mecca because it became too dangerous for him to be there, and he went to Medina, and those are their two holiest cities, Mecca being the first and Medina being the second, Jerusalem being the third. When he fled, that was when they began their date. Maybe that was when they just didn't understand why, didn't find a reason why. In general, Islam is an Abrahamic, meaning we know traces back to Abraham in the story that we looked at this past week in the Genesis text. God said to Abraham, I'm going to give you descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. And Abraham was old and his wife was old, and they're like this, they're past the childbearing years. And Abraham takes it, once again, another example of Abraham or a human being taking upon themselves sort of steering the will of God. And so it's kind of like Saul instead of David, but in this case, it was Abraham having relations with Hagar, thinking he was going to begin the descendants that way, and God said, and then God, in a pretty ruthless way, says, "Get out of here, kick her out." And so he gives her what did it say, a wine or a skin of water. I'm like, well, how much could that have been? See, that was the first camelback. And sent her off, and as the scriptures portray, got to the point where she couldn't survive and put the child under a bush and went to a place where she couldn't see the child die. And this is God intervening, saying, "I will make you a great nation from him as well." Another miracle. So whether we like it or not, we have to hold this tension around the idea that Islam as a religion and Muslims as practicing Islam are our kin.
I'm having a real hard time with that. What religion did they have before Muhammad came along? They didn't have any connection with Abraham.
It came from a number of smaller, and I didn't even write down all the names of them, groups of people, tribes that basically acquiesced to what this point of revelation.
They thought that before Muhammad got his revelation?
No, that's the revelation is what began all of it.
I know, it was with Muhammad, but you've got how many years between Abraham and Muhammad?
A lot. Well, but the bloodline is still there.
Say that Muslims go back.
The bloodline is there through Ishmael.
The bloodline, yeah, and they connected with that, but there was no Muslim religion.
Well, there was no Islam religion until the sixth. We talked about that last week. It was a Yahwehist. So the evolution of people's faith, and they were monotheistic. And again, we often try to group religions in these big clusters. Whereas, that is in the realm of the study of world religions, one of the things that is criticized as much is that we kind of clump everything into a few big groups, whereas at this time, before this was formed, you had a lot of tribal religions, and the same thing was happening in Judaism. When they exiled, when the Assyrians attacked Israel in the north and drew them out and brought them in, then those religions and those gods and those things all affected. This was still in that sort of or what was it called, a mono, what was the term, monoliterist or something like that. But the idea that God was Yahweh was the ultimate God, but all these other gods still exist. But you had the Assyrian influence, you had the Babylonian influence, you had the Persian influence, you had the Egyptian influence, and every single one of those influences within these pockets of what we now call Judaism or the Yahwehist would have looked different. But they would have still carried some central themes that guided, and those central themes were both passed down through genetics and through cultural appropriation for those cultures around them, in the same way that the Jews adapted to the Canaanites or all the other, the Babylonians, the Persians. So that's why when you have the return of the Jews after exile to the temple, this is when the divide between the Samaritans and the Jews really gets ignited, because again, Samaritans were Jews, those were northern Israelites. And the southern Israelites who went and were exiled in Persia came back, and so then they felt like they were the remnant, and this is where you get the big divide. So all that's to say is there wasn't in the same way as Judaism was formed, there were lots of world religions around the time, or tribal religions or tribal beliefs around spirituality. The coalescence of that happened in Abraham, but even that didn't happen overnight. I mean, Abraham and then Isaac, and it wasn't as there was a lot of, it wasn't until Egypt, it wasn't until slavery that you see the proliferation of a people group. Yeah, Ken.
So they believe in God, but they don't believe in Jesus Christ or the Holy Spirit.
The Islam? So the question was, do they believe in Jesus Christ? They believe in God? Yes.
But Jesus Christ was a prophet rather than God's son.
Yes. And so was Muhammad. To be clear, Muhammad, and they believe, and so we'll get into the prophets, but the short of it is Adam, Moses, Adam, Moses, I don't want to leave anyone out. Adam, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, they were all major prophets in Islam. They are major prophets in Islam. And the last prophet that came in the 700s, again, different timing, was the final prophet. So think in terms of the whole story. You have Adam, prophet, and led, in the sense of a covenant that we talked about. The covenant. You think these are all covenants, and then you have Abraham established, and Ishmael being that God saying, "I'll make a great nation out of you," and then you have Moses giving the law, and much of what Muslims believe mirror the Old Testament's the Ten Commandments. You have Jesus, and they actually have a holy book that is their version of the gospel, or the Gospels, and that tell the story of Jesus as a prophet. And then 700 years after Jesus, Muhammad. So take the divinity out of who Jesus was in your mindset. Jews don't believe Jesus was divine. Jews believe Jesus was a madman, or was a prophet that just went wayward. We believe Jesus was divine. Islam, in a similar way, doesn't see Jesus as divine, but sees Jesus as one of the major prophets of Islam. I mean, high respect. They wouldn't, they would be disgraced at someone being disparaging towards Jesus just as much, or probably more, than we are. Yeah, they do believe in Jesus, and they have a special category for him, but they do see him as a prophet. And honestly, there are heresies through the history of the Christian church in the last 2,000 years that question that very nature, and there's a biblical warrant for it. Why didn't Jesus demonstrate powers before he was baptized? Why did he say, "Father, take this away from me"? There are the passages that emphasize the humanity of this. This is, my beloved son. Does that mean that God couldn't have adopted Jesus? And that's where we get into the creeds of the church that we'll look at over this summer. That's why these periods of the church are so important, because they had to figure that stuff out. What we're just taught as being commonplace for us are things that needed to be figured out.
One question.
Yes.
Do they believe in the physical resurrection of Jesus?
No, they would not have
Okay.
believed in that because, and that's where and again, they have their own version of the
Okay,
gospel.
I just,
So, no, because they do believe in we'll get into that, but they do believe in the resurrection of the body. Actually, a lot of their theology is very similar to Christian theology, and we'll touch on that in a few minutes. They believe that Islam, as I said earlier, means submission to God, submission in the sense of, and like I said here, if the issue for Islam is pride, pride of humanity, and the Hebrew, I mean, Judaism has the same concept. The fear of God is not, oh, I'm so afraid God's going to kill me or punish me. The fear of God and the wisdom of God are found in a right appropriation of who God is to who we are. And Islam carries that same sentiment in the sense of pride is thinking us higher than we ought and placing ourselves on some sort of equal par with God, or in their case would even be the fashioning of God, who God is, out of our own image of who God should be, is also a mortal sin. I mean, that's a serious, and when we think about what we've done in terms of our culture, both left and right, through the last 2,000 years of how we've fashioned Jesus or God the Father or the Spirit in all sorts of different ways, we would have been guilty of idolatry, essentially making a false God out of who God is, which is again, for Islam, not again, but I mean, like us, it is essentially the unforgivable sin. Now, we believe in a God that's more gracious. It's like, it's like, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Dogma. You ever seen Dogma? I'm not recommending it. It's about, I don't know, 20 years old. It was a spoof on the Catholic Church, but it's pretty crass. Not recommending it. Don't go watch it. I never said anything about Dogma. They do believe that that Islam is the most complete and most universally binding of faith out there. So in the same way we as Christians hold that this is the exclusivity of Christianity, they believe that that's it. Christianity is false, and they are right. And everyone else is wrong in that regard too. And they view both Judaism and Christianity as predecessors to Islam. In other words, in the same way you see Judaism come up and then it transitions into Christianity. So you're following that? And then 700 years into that narrative, another prophet comes along, brings further clarity. And again, when you want to look at the way we canonize scripture, that happened all over the place. Revelation was debated into the last millennia. And yet how many denominations are divided by our views of what Revelation says? So in the midst of, and sometimes that's one of the biggest assumptions we bring to the table often, is just that the Christianity that we've experienced in our lifetime is the Christianity that's always been there. And as you'll learn this summer in the church history stuff, Christianity has changed dramatically over the last 2,000 years, both in terms of authority, both in terms of scripture, both in terms of view of scripture, theology across the board. In fact, most Christians of certain periods of our church would think that we're all big lazy sinners and would have rejected us from the church. At least most of us. Just kidding. Maybe you get it. You get it.
Let me ask you.
Yes.
Are you saying that they view Judaism and Christianity as background or?
In the same way, yeah, so yes, what I'm saying is in the same way we view Christianity as based on Judaism, we're like an extension of Judaism or an advancement or, an improvement or whatever, 2.0, Judaism 2.0, I don't know, I mean, we call it what you want. That Christianity in that 700-year period also contributed to what Islam is as a religion. Okay? All right, yes,
The last book in the Bible,
Revelation.
what serial is it from? Revelations,
When was it written? I don't know off the top of my head.
when did it happen?
Oh, when was it canonized? I'm gonna guess. I think it was 800 or 900, but I don't remember.
No, not not.
The question was just when Revelation was, um,
The last.
when they accepted the book.
No, when
Well, that's-
did, okay,
Let's come back to that later, because that's a little side note. Oh, and this will answer your question. Originally it wasn't called Islam, it was called Mohammedanism, and because it came from Muhammad. Today, just before we get into history, there are two denominations. 85 to 90% are Sunni, which are probably the largest or the oldest, and then Shia Islam is 10 to 15%. In general, in the same way, the differences are subtle. In the same way, there isn't a rejection, a total rejection. There's just and that's the major ones. There's also just like Christianity, there's a lot of smaller ones. I don't think it's fragmented as much as Christianity, but I think that's because Christianity has also been subject to the effects of capitalism and entrepreneurialism and just Western expansion. And so as that happens and people become more individuals, we diversify our faith.
Jason?
Yeah.
But wasn't it in Iraq that after we had gotten involved in there, though, and pulled out, you saw the Sunni and the Shia fighting, and you had majority and minority. It didn't seem to get along very well at all.
No, I'm not trying to suggest they get along, but the differences they listed weren't, in my opinion, of course, if you look at Christianity and you say, what's the difference between Catholics and Protestants, we generally have the same fundamental beliefs. So in other words, we're looking at, and what we're going to look at today is more representative of Sunni than it is of Shia. So, but
it looked like they were killing each other pretty good.
well, the Roman Catholics and the Protestants did a good number on themselves too. In other words, I couldn't answer to the history of, I didn't go deep into the history of, or even any of the history between the two. So, and I'm sure it's in one of those books though. Let me give you the general history of how it worked, and then and what they do today. It began in the early 600s. Actually, Muhammad was in Arabia, in what is now Saudi Arabia, near the city, or what is the city of Mecca. And Muhammad in 610 received several revelations, and I don't remember which one, but there were two. There are two angels listed. One is Michael, and one is Gabriel. So again, another overlap with Scripture that gave him these revelations, and they centered around the first was submission to God. Again, where you get the word Islam. The second was the Last Judgment, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But their view of the Last Judgment is almost identical to ours. The resurrection of the body, good and bad. They have definitely more of a works mentality, or it would be more akin to Roman Catholicism. But remember, if it's coming around in the 7th to the 13th century, it sort of forms itself over that 500-year period, also a 500-year period for those of you who are on Sunday. But it developed during a time, the same time the Roman Catholic Church did. So that relationship between works and faith solidified itself during the development of Islam in a way that we in the Protestant Reformation were like, no, you don't need works, it's just faith. We're hoping. That's good. We hope we're right on that. We could be wrong. We are disagreeing with 1,500 years of the church, bless you. But I'm riding on it too, so let's hope for the best. In 622, in Mecca, there was opposition from the nobility of that region, because Muhammad was came out as a prophet and was calling people the last one, the Last Judgment, and then the last one was care for the poor and needy. And that was an affront to the nobility. They didn't want to have to give their money. They didn't want to have to give almsgivings. They didn't want to have to sacrifice. And so the prosperity that the nobility in the area had gathered or gained was a threat to them. So they said, you know what, we're going to run them out. So they got with the authorities, and the authorities put pressure, and he had to leave. And so he flees from that, and that's where you get the beginning of their date in 622. And he moved to Medina. And then he died 10 years later. And that was the big issue of who succeeded. I just wrote that down. I have a lot of notes on here, they're very small. But the biggest issue between the Sunni and the Shia was the succession of Muhammad. And so it's about the different line, and one feels.
One was biological and one wasn't.
I'm not even sure. I just know that was the whole. There's books on the succession issue of. You could almost view it as the filioque, the dividing of, does the Spirit come from the Father and the Son, or just the Father? And so again, we think, well, that doesn't seem like a huge issue. We could talk about it, and we could leave and disagree with one another. But the succession of that, in terms of a line of succession, probably matters more to them than it does to us. In the 8th century, from that time, Islam began to spread, and that's not surprising because that's also when Christianity spread. In fact, there's an abbey in Cluny in France, which is about 5 kilometers from Taizé, actually, the community, the chants we sing on Sunday. But they're the birthplace of Western monasticism, and everything spread out from there. At the same time that was happening, you have this explosion of religion in the Islam faith throughout different parts of the world. Now, if I were to refer back to your churches, let's think for a moment and think back to like the 90s and the early 2000s of the churches you were in. Would any of you call those the golden years of the church then? Usually when people look back, they think of it, there was Hillsong was going, there was just, I don't know, there was something about the 90s that people refer back to, with a lot of praise music came out of that time. Churches were just doing stuff, and I mean, Presbyterian churches, evangelical churches, the Roman Catholic Church, they were all sort of booming and thriving. And what I want you to note in that is that cultural trends happen in terms of global citizenship to some extent. The pandemic, for example, is going to have a dramatic effect on the entire globe in different ways, but in different sections and different continents, but in different cultures. Western cultures, you see that 500-year shift that happens every 500 years, and I think sometimes you also see that here as well. You see some of those shifts.
Jason,
Yes.
How did they spread the Muslim religion? Wasn't it militarily?
No, they had a season for that, like we do for the Crusades. I mean,
I know, but we didn't take over countries like, then they came into
Yeah,
Spain.
kinda. Yeah, we did.
And
we raped and pillaged.
I know, but we didn't spread the religion like they did. They didn't make everybody.
No, kinda. I
And
mean,
when they went into, the big divide was there with, I can't even think, Austria. If we hadn't stopped them there, the whole Europe would have been Muslim.
maybe not. I mean, we don't. You never know. But I would say that we too have committed these atrocities.
I agree we have, but they spread their religion militarily.
So did we. I mean, when Constantine made Christianity legal in 318,
Yeah.
no one had a choice.
Yeah, I'll agree with that.
So it was like, you're Christian, there you go. And so, yeah, we absolutely did that.
But that doesn't make the way they spread it better.
No, I didn't say that.
good.
I didn't say it was better or good. I just, it just spread.
Isn't there a passage in the Quran that says if they can't spread the religion peacefully, they need to spread it by the sword, I think is the word they use?
I can't comment on that. Again, it's a big religion, but I'm sure my gut would be that probably there's a lot of exterior writing. If it's not in the Quran, I wouldn't necessarily, and everything that I have read about it as an actual religion, that would not, the nature of the sword would not be something that was promoted. But let's not forget that the Old Testament is filled with deaths that came from the hand of Israel.
Yeah.
Babies were killed by a plague sent by God. Canaanites were killed, Egyptians died, how many civilizations suffered at the hand of Yahweh. So this is, and I say that with utter respect for who God is, and that's because we want to conceptualize a God that's perfect and doesn't make mistakes, and that's a mistake. And does that say that God isn't perfect because God makes mistakes? Do you think, did God flooded the whole earth and killed everything?
Well, he's apologized, so we know it.
There you go. Well, and that's the thing is, and the other part of that, just in general, is that's also relying on the absolute validity of every word as a literal form of the Bible.
Right.
So there's a lot, there's a lot at play, and this goes why we talked about the very first week about our hermeneutics. We've got to, in some sense, step back and not say what our cultural perception is. Yeah, Muslims flew some planes into some towers and gave us one of the most horrendous events of the last century. But in the name of Jesus, Hitler took over Germany and killed, how many Jews? And so atrocities exist in every religion. There is no one that is free from sin. Neil, nice and loud.
Quran, like in Syria 3, Muhammad has a mandate. Your sole purpose on this earth is to kill the infidel, failure to do so will result in your death.
And again, I'm not a Muslim expert, or I'm not Islam, so I can't speak to what I would say to any of you who have things like that, or what you said. I would say find them and bring them to me, and we can talk about them. But otherwise, it's anecdotal to me, because not that I don't trust what you say, but there's a lot of things that people in our culture say Christians think that we don't all agree with, and they get made and attributed to the Bible. And that's not always the case. And we live in a culture that is fearful of Islam and Muslims in an unfair way. Is it warranted in some way? Yeah, I think the natural reaction when you feel that sense of of fear, but that fear is wrong.
Well,
It's justified, but
there's many people that base what they are professing, saying it's in the Bible. There's the Jones, the Koresh,
carry on.
the ones in Hollywood. What
Yeah.
was his name that had
Scientology.
huh?
Scientology.
Yeah.
And again-
well, the guy that killed all those people, the crazy guy.
The Branch Davidians, which I learned last week is not funny to bring up in bingo, because there's a lot of Texans there.
Jason, will you cover when the Quran was written after Muhammad?
I will.
Okay.
I mean, well, yes, and there's yeah. No, and I understand. There's lots of questions, and I am far from an expert on this. I am like, I read a lot of resources, and my head is buzzing with information, and I'm trying to make connections. But again, when it's in another language, everything's written in Arabic, but what I'll try to do is I'm trying to connect where they have more the similarities and differences to Christianity and why those are what they are. I'm almost done with the history though, and I think here to answer the question about the spread, there was something called the Islamic Golden Age that happened between 786 to 809. So, several decades. It was where they established something called the House of Wisdom, and they also translated sacred texts that belong to the Western canon into Arabic and into Persian. And therefore, in many ways, are credited with also preserving our sacred texts, which I thought was fascinating. And so there's this period where, and at the same time, monks were doing it for the Western culture as well. But during that whole period, West and East, and in the Middle East, you had people of faith preserving ancient and sacred texts. And quite frankly, if they had not, we would have an entirely different understanding of Scripture and of salvation and of God today. Take out any book of the Bible and ask what it takes out of your understanding of God. If Revelation was never something that was written there, how differently the church would be today. So that's not a small piece that they also preserved, but it spread during that time, and in particular then, and just to get into your point, in the 11th and 12th century, it spread throughout southern Europe and Africa, And then in the 13th and 14th, there was a Mongol invasion and the Black Plague hit, and it weakened their expansion as a whole. But then from the 14th century to the 18th century, it was called the Age of the Islamic Gunpowder. And this is where some of the more militaristic conquest happened. And that's when they took over the Ottoman Turkey, India, and Iran. And because of this gunpowder age and the mechanization of weapons of war, they became a military power, and by force then forced people into it. And yes, they still do today. And I'm not, when I go back to the Philippines, I'm not allowed to go anywhere because they see someone who looks white and they think you're a Christian, and there are Muslims there that will capture you and chop your heads off. So it's there, and that's what it. All right. Let me pause there and I want to make sure. Let's talk about Muhammad a little bit. They both think he was the main and final prophet. And again, the succession issue is where that becomes an issue for the division of the Sunni and the Shia. But in addition to the Quran, there's something called the Sunnah, which are the teachings and example of Muhammad, and they are considered really in many ways more, and this is where you may get some of the sword stuff, and I'm not sure, because here's, again, sacred texts are sacred texts. We assign the same level of sacredness to the whole Bible. Other world religions do not do that. They're not like everything is in the same equal, category. And so like Jews that say the Torah is more important than the prophets, and the prophets are more important than the writings, they too have a tier of sacred texts. The first is the Quran, and I'll tell you about how that came about in a second. And then the second is the Injil, or the Gospels, and that is their story of Jesus, the prophet. They call him Isa. And it is different from our Gospels, but there's lots of similarities. In other words, it is a retelling or rewriting. But remember, ours weren't written, ours are written in the latter part of the 1st century, and then some of the oldest manuscripts we even have of those go back to the 4th century. So although they were written and compiled then, they, some of the oldest manuscripts are still pretty late in the modern era. But they have a version of the Gospels that highlights Jesus as a prophet. Then there's the Zabur, which we equate with the Psalms, and so it's praise of Allah, and the Tawrat, which is their Torah. But Christians and Jews would look at these other three groups of scriptures, or their holy scriptures, still a second tier down from the Quran, as being distorted. But in the same way, things get passed down through transmission through thousands of years of church history, both in Judaism and in Christianity. Those words that God gave Paul might have been the exact words that God gave Paul, but then you're also, if you think those are we have the exact words that God gave Paul, and the exact, you have all sorts of, transmission issues, you have translation issues, you have paraphrase issues. So when you're reading the Message, you're pretty far probably from, not that the sentiments aren't the same and the meaning isn't the same, but to hold that these were the words that God gave Paul to write down is probably more a challenge for many once you start digging around in it. But these are different books, and they're on the second tier. And then but in addition to the Quran, there's something called the Sunnah, which are the teachings and examples and writings about how Muhammad believed that people should live. So Muhammad becomes not only the final prophet, he becomes the moral exemplar for how a Muslim ought to live in the world. Now, what's similar to this is we in Christianity have a moral exemplar theory of the atonement. And not that we weren't justified in that, but that Christ came to give us a moral exemplar, a perfect example of what it means to live out faith. This is what the Buddha is in Buddhism. We'll talk about it. He's a existential exemplar for how one, and the ultimate of how one human can exist. Jesus then became the ultimate example of how a human could resist sin and be pure and exist in the world in that way, in the same way Muhammad functions in that way. It's called, and the Sunnah is found in the writings called the Sadith, which means in a trodden path, and it means that just basically follow the path of Muhammad. Today, people return to the site where they believe Muhammad had the first encounter with the angel, where these revelations were given, and that is in Mecca. And you've probably seen the pictures. Yeah, feel free to open those doors. You've probably seen the pictures of the mosque that's open air, and it's the big square, big black thing in the middle, and there are just thousands of, or however many it holds, of Muslims around, and they're all praying. You know what I'm talking about? Is that an image in their head? So this is the holiest spot in the whole world for Muslims. It holds something called the Black Stone, and the Black Stones, I have notes all over the place. The Black Stones are essentially well, some people think they're meteorites, but they believe it's the stone that essentially, the myth of it is that the stone came out of the sky, and Adam and Eve, it compelled them to offer the first sacrifice. So in their schema of sacrifice, it was instituted, because we are asking this question about Judaism. How did this whole thing of sacrifice come out? Well, they account for this. Stone comes out of the sky. It was assigned to Adam and Eve that they ought to offer sacrifice, and it creates a sacrificial system. In 605, it fell from heaven, to build an altar, and they thought it was a meteorite because of its black nature. But this is also the spot where this thing fell, that they think that Abraham went to sacrifice Isaac. And in this, what is called a Kaaba, which is a 49-foot tall, 34 and some change foot wide, and 39 foot the other, like this, square box that contains this black stone, or fragments of this black stone. Funny thing is that it fell apart sometime, and then they actually cemented it back together. So if you type in black stone in Islam, it looks like, I don't know, it looks kind of goofy. But, we do weird things in Christianity too. So, but that's in there. There are two horns in there that are thought to be the horns from the ram that Abraham, that saved Isaac from being sacrificed, which I think is really interesting, considering the fact that Ishmael was rejected and Isaac was the replacement, or the place where the covenant came to be.
But where is this place?
It's in Mecca, which is in Saudi Arabia.
So when we went to the Dome of the Rock, they showed us a rock that
Yes.
they said Abraham sacrificed.
That's where Jews and Christians believe.
No, that Muslims in the Dome of the Rock told us that's where Abraham sacrificed
Ishmael.
what's his name?
Well, that stone was moved too.
I don't know, that's what they told us, but that one where it was, right there in the Dome of the Rock.
Well, Jerusalem is
And
the,
we
so,
saw the big rock.
yeah, I know what you're talking about. I only can tell you what I read. So.
So they have, some of them think it was one place and some think. it
Well,
was another
well,
place.
or I could be wrong, and maybe I misunderstood something, but the stones themselves, where the stone that's in Mecca is the stone, it's the stone. It's not necessarily, or maybe that's it. Maybe I'm putting this together. Maybe maybe the stone was what fell out of the sky, and the rock was where it fell. But to be honest with you, I don't know the
forget
answer.
a lot of stuff, but I thought that the Dome of the Rock, the significance was some type of flight, the mystical horse Muhammad flew.
I'm not,
and
that
I thought
again,
that's where.
well, there you go. Maybe that's where it is. I don't know.
We were told that when we saw the rock, that Muhammad ascended to do something from that rock.
Well, maybe that's where he
In-
ascended.
In
Well, and he
Israel.
also sacrificed his.
Yeah.
Who was it, not?
Okay.
Again, you know what, you can go to Bethlehem and look at a little glass thing that's apparently has the blood of Jesus caps in it. So, I mean, in every religion, and there are some that would argue that you can go to Jerusalem, they said that the city's been rebuilt so many times, to even say that you walked on the same stones that Jesus walked on would be ridiculous. So the nature of these things are, you go to the Garden Tomb, and it's got this nice square door that goes over, like that, you know, this is, and so I can't necessarily, I don't know the answer to that, Donna, I'm sorry, but
Well,
we
maybe
can,
there's a difference of opinion between the Muslims.
well, or it was where Muhammad took off, I'm not sure. But the stone building is at the center of the Mecca, the mosque in Mecca, and returning to, and we'll get to this in a second, returning to this mosque is one of the pillars of Muslim devotion. In other words, they're expected to do this. And not everyone has to do things. There are exceptions in the same way there are in Christianity as well. It's considered the house of God. It's similar to the tabernacle or the temple in the sense of where God dwells most heavily, or God's presence is. At one point in this place on Mecca, this Kaaba, or this area, contained 360 idols, and Muhammad went to back to conquest Mecca, and when he did, he took out these 360 idols. And that is when the monotheistic expression of Islam found its sort of roots, because it was an abolishment or a clearing of the temple, and the monotheism comes out of that. Let's do the 6 articles of belief in Islam. What time is it? I don't even know. The 6 articles of belief in Islam. Before I do that, we'll go through them. But Allah, you've heard the term, you know, Allah for God. I thought this was interesting. That's not necessarily the Muslim God. That's just their understanding of God. So when they refer, it's the Arabic word for God. So when they refer to Yahweh or to, you know, the Christian God, they would refer to it as Allah. Now that's sort of, you know, doubly loaded in the sense of that's their general term, but you might also say they're expressing that their belief is the true belief. But again, that's the progressive thing, going from Judaism to Christianity to Islam. You know, we believe we progressed, but then we stopped. And actually, that's true for the Christian church as well. You have this progression. You have Orthodoxy running, and then you have the Western church saying, no, we're right. And then you have the Protestant church saying, no, we're right. And then you have, you know, every other denomination in the world saying, we're right. So, they believe in a personal God, not in this, but here's the interesting thing. When we say personal God, we think relational God. We're like, Lord, I've had a really bad day. Just give me some, you know, strength. They don't have a casual nature with the personal God. When I say personal God, they believe there is no intermediary between them and God. There's no clergy, there's no priest, that they are able to, by their actions, directly communicate with the divine. And we, for many years, and this is what Rome, you know, this was the challenge of Roman Catholicism, believed that our faith was mediated by a priest or the Pope ultimately. And we still hold on to that, to be honest with you. I mean, you know, how many, you know why people want me to pray on Sunday?
Oh, yeah.
Do you think my prayers are any more effective than any of yours? Well, they're not. I don't have like a VIP pass to God's ear or to God's will. I pray as a figure of comfort and for our community, so that we, and I believe when I pray on Sunday for the needs that are brought up to our church, you know, yes, God already knows those needs. You know, I always love when people pray and they're like, Lord, and this happened, and I'm like, God knows what happened. You don't have to tell him. But
When I was going to Catholic school, that was the big question for me, that I had difficulty with. That we had to go through the priest, you know, confess to the priest and all that. And a new young priest came and he explained it to me in a different way. By the way, I think in Vatican II, they actually made that statement that you can go directly to God. But he explained, if you're going to court, you probably want an attorney that knows the law, that knows those things. So when you go to the priest and ask for help in prayer, he's the attorney going to God.
Yeah.
For my little 6-year-old brain, that made sense.
and they don't have that system. In the same way, we as Protestants, most of us, I think Protestants, now believe that we just can go to God. We can, but even in that schema, Jesus is the intercessor and the Spirit is the go-between. So, which they would reject. They also believe, like we do, in that there is no gender in God. God's not male or female, but they reject the plurality of God. So while we have a plurality in one in the Trinity, they do not. God is one, and in that regard, it makes Islam really, along with Judaism, the only two purely monotheistic faiths, because we believe in one God, but we believe there's three persons. So, and again, that's that Greek influence, the Hellenization. They have 6 articles of belief that they adhere to. One is called Tawhid, and it means the oneness of God. There was a period in their history where they had a more pantheistic view of God, that is, that God is in all things, versus a pantheism that God is all things. They don't believe in the Trinity. They believe and they view Christians' view of the Trinity as idolatry, that we've divided God into not that there are lesser gods, but whether we admit that they're all equal or not, we don't often treat them all that way. We have, it's particular, I think the Presbyterian Church has done a bad job of that. They don't have icons of God, and they typically refer to God by a name or attributes. In other words, you don't see pictures of God. We have pictures of God because we have Jesus in the flesh, and we construct Jesus in these ways. But we do, in some sense, have these images of God. Or we can, you think about Michelangelo's, the hand touching the hand of Adam, the anthropomorphization of God. But the oneness of God is one unity. The afterlife, they believe in a heaven or a paradise, and that's called Yana. And they also believe in a hell, and that's called Yahanan, very similar to one. And they believe in a final judgment, and it's called Yam al Qiyamah. And that there will be tribulation and there will be trials before that. Sound a little familiar to Revelation? So that's the second thing, afterlife and the understanding of that. Their view of creation is that God created everything just like ours, and actually have more of a speak it into existence. There's a phrase from the Quran that says, "Be and it is." And so that was the speaking into existence in the same way we believe that God created ex nihilo, out of nothing. They believe that the purpose of all of creation is the existence of the worship of God. Sounds a lot like the first article of the Westminster Catechism. What is the purpose of man or human? The glorification of God and delight in him. We were created as the celestial beings were to glorify God. And that, I think that, and don't let that slip through your fingers. That's pretty significant. It is, the sense of we were created to glorify the one God. Now, we understand who that God is differently, but they have that same act of devotion, the same desire, the same longing to please the divine that makes them kin to us as spiritual seekers. Angels were created to worship God in the same way they were. It was, if those of us who joined us for the angelology or the celestial beings last year. Angels are there to communicate revelations to us in the same way angels communicated some of the most significant things in the Bible to our patriarchs and to our matriarchs. I mean, the angel came to Mary and to Elizabeth and to Joseph. Well, they're the same function. I do think this is interesting. They believe angels are there that they record human actions. So it means we have some angels or angelic beings checking out what we're doing and writing that down like Santa Claus, naughty or nice list. They also believe it's the angel's job to take the soul at death, which I think is absolutely fascinating, because we don't really, and I'm not saying that we don't as Christianity, but I've never researched that, and I didn't really dig into it in Christianity. But the idea, when we were talking about celestial beings last year, and the idea that there are celestial beings controlling the weather systems and the principalities and powers that exist in this world, and then when Jesus said, "Waters be still," he was commanding the celestial beings to still the water. Someone's in charge of the water. Something's in charge of the water. And the idea that they're, like, what happens when you die? Does your soul know where it's going? It's like, does your soul have like a GPS tracker? And they're like, okay, this is where I'm headed. Does it happen instantaneously? The people talk about going down to the tunnel to a bright light. What happens to one's soul? So the idea that they have accounted for an angel being the transport, the Uber, the angel Uber to get your soul where it's going. They believe angels were created out of light and fire, and that and both Gabriel and Michael are mentioned in the Quran. And again, that really shouldn't surprise anyone when you think about it as a progression. They're taking all of these sacred texts and they're borrowing from them, and they incorporate them as they will. They do believe in prophets, and we mentioned all those earlier. And they're all the same prophets that we are, but they believe prophets were chosen by God, and that the final prophet was Muhammad. And that's why Muhammad's not God. Muhammad and Jesus are on similar playing fields. Muhammad is just sort of the ultimate, in the way Jesus is the ultimate prophet of the prophets we get, Muhammad's their ultimate prophet. Because quite frankly, if you don't think Jesus resurrected, then Jesus was just some dude who was a prophet who thought he was going to be resurrected and didn't. They believe in the bodily resurrection as well, that when that final judgment happens, that our bodies will be resurrected, the same as we do. Good stuff. Sin, I think, is interesting. They believe that most sins are forgivable, but there are some sins that are not, similar to us in terms of blasphemy of the Holy Spirit. They believe if you avoid the major sins, that your minor sins will be forgiven. And they do not believe in the original sin. They believe that everyone is, and so I didn't get too deeply into that, I'm sure, but my guess would be that it's just the condition of fallen, it's a condition of humanity, and by virtue of modeling and, we're creatures we're animals that function in a self-preservation way. And so we then take on the guilt of that sin in the same way Adam and Eve took it on for what we claim for everybody. Now in our schema, Jesus wiped that original stain away, which means we're not held accountable for that, so that's how we can still be sinners, but not held accountable for the original sin. They have no category for original sin. And their word for doing something really bad is shirk, not shrek, but shirk, like you shirk someone, I guess, I don't know. And that is the unforgivable sin, and they believe that happens when we partner something with God unnaturally or unjustifiably, or there is no justification. God is one, and so they would believe that this is the biggest Christian they would have with Christians. The view of the Trinity is that we would qualify for that. We've attached other things to God, because they would probably view Yahweh as being like the source or the. And we kind of operate like that too. Like, Yahweh's the dad, Jesus is the son who did his bidding, and the Holy Spirit is, the go-between, or what I say most respectfully, we treat the Holy Spirit as the lapdog of the Trinity. It's there, we talk about it, but we don't really assign the same level of attributes of the divine, of God, to the Holy Spirit. How often do we say God, Holy Spirit, God? We say Father God, we say Jesus Christ God, but we often don't say Spirit of God. So here's the good and the bad deeds. I thought they actually have a much more ordered system of sin, so it's pretty clear where you stand on these things. The good deed, the bad deeds are, the order of sin are to shirk, which is, you again partner something with God, and that is where you get into the unforgivable part. The second is murder. The third is theft. The fourth is taking something from an orphan who is in your care. That's like a real jerk move for Muslims. They're like that, I don't know what situation. I mean, there might be a lot of, but before we go any farther, notice that sense of no other gods before, or not partnering with God. Murder, theft, sounds a lot like the Old Testament. Again, they're influenced by Judaism. The fifth is not praying. The sixth is not giving or almsgiving or tithing. The seventh is not fasting, but there are lots of provisions for fasting, elderly, sickly, all sorts of reasons. Men, for women, if you're on your period, you don't have to fast, all sorts of things, disabled. If you don't take your pilgrimages, if you cut ties with your parents, honoring your parents, it sounds a little very similar. Interestingly enough, the 10th is homosexuality, and the 11th is adultery and fornication. So they're right next to one another. The 12th is drinking, and that's all the farther I wrote down. So, so basically you have, infractions against your neighbor. You have being stealing, murder, adultery, and then you have, sort of crimes against the religion as a whole, not tithing or fasting, and those would be, I guess, towards God. And then to counteract those, except for shirking, that's not like twerking, it's just shirking. That's a generational joke. I can tell which of you watch YouTube. The best thing you can do is enjoining rightness, and that's just bringing truth and rightness and holiness into the world. Forbidding sin, so stopping a sin from happening. Showing kindness to all, and here's where it gets interesting. Planting trees, so a much stronger creation care theology than I think we have in the West. We're like, let's just, suck all the oil out of the ground and burn down the trees and do what we want with them for our own pleasure. Muslims do not have that. And not to say that you don't have abuse in that or have different deviations of that, but in general, Muslims are not a wealthy religion. Christianity is a wealthy religion. Not hurting animals and not bringing harm to animals, being kind to your parents, forgiving others, seeking out reconciliation, picking up things that are harmful. So I guess like if you see a needle on the ground or something, if you pick that up, that's a good thing. Respecting other religions and raising an orphan. And so they have very specific things that are listed that they are expected that they can either go on the bad list or the good list. Yeah, Ben.
But you don't see many trees in the Middle East, so I'm wondering.
Maybe that's why. Maybe they were like, Muhammad's like, you know what? Let's just stick this in the cannon and we'll get more trees out of it.
So Jason, where Christianity or Catholicism as a progression over the years, let's just take homosexuality.
Yeah.
They do not, is that right? There isn't.
I'm sure that there are liberal Muslims as well. I think in any religion of the world, you have that spectrum.
Okay.
And really what that boils down to, if you want to put on a different level, people have different frames of mind of thinking about culture and cultural change. And the majority are traditionalists, but there are those, and on the other end of the traditionalists, you would say we're all moderate people. Well, you got Amish, who are, really stringent about something. You got Christians in the middle over here, and then traditionalists over here. You have a spectrum across every religion. It's always going to be there. The last thing I want to give you is the 5 daily pillars, and then I want to make sure, and I have my list here of the categories we've gone through. But these are the 5 things that are expected of every Muslim. Daily prayer 5 times, morning, midday, afternoon, sunset, and evening. Almsgiving. So it's considered, we're pretty loosey-goosey in the church. In the Presbyterian church, I'd say in general, we give 2 to 3%. Now we're more of a professional crowd, so we still sustain. But compared to evangelical traditions that have a more rigid 10%, you give, this is what you do, mainline denominations typically don't. But they survive on, mainline denominations typically tend to be more of a white-collar crowd with higher income, so it balances itself out.
Are they prayers, rote prayers?
Yeah, I
Catholic
mean,
Church?
absolutely. And well, it's not just Catholic. I mean, we have rote prayers in Protestantism as well. Yeah, I mean, there you go. That's a prime one we all use. Fasting happens on Ramadan, and that is, this year it happened, it is a moving holiday because it's based on the lunar cycle, but that happened this year, March 23rd to April something. And the 10 days before and 10 days after, it's basically you fast during the daylight hours, and then in the evening you can eat, which I think is interesting because they make provisions. If you're in some weird time zone, like up in Alaska or something, you can use the hours of the closest city that is in the parallel of Mecca. So in other words, you can use the hours. And so there's legalism in the sense of our expectation to do, but there's also provision. In the same way they're like, if you're elderly or sickly, you don't have to fast. We're not expecting you to die or to put yourself in danger. But Ramadan is a period of about a month. It moves or it expands and shrinks, but it's a season of fasting, and they fast from everything: alcohol, sex, tobacco, and I'm not sure, maybe meat even that, but they fast from sort of the vices of the world in particular, but also food as well. Pilgrimage to Mecca is considered one of the 5 pillars, and the last is taking a creed or oath, and that's your declaration of faith. That would be our faith confession sort of thing. I would say that these pillars were developed at a time where I think also as the Christian church was turning to Western monasticism, daily prayers, well, monastic communities still do daily prayers, we just don't. Almsgiving, giving, tithing, that's a part of our faith too. Fasting, it's not something we do very much. But it's something they do in the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church more, and in some denominations. We don't really have that sense of pilgrimage. We lost that in probably sometime after the Reformation. We stopped doing it as much. I think the need to do that or the compulsion to do that wasn't there, but it still exists today. I mean, Tizay is a pilgrimage site for 100,000 young adults every year. Jerusalem, we take tourism trips, but that's a pilgrimage. It's a journey. The hikers that we welcome every week, they're on a pilgrimage. It's a journey to figure something out, to seek something out. But those are the 5 pillars, and that really defines their experience as Muslims. Yeah. Daily prayers, almsgiving, fasting, pilgrimage, and a creed or an oath to it. And I would say that those are, they don't use the term sacramental. But I would say that those are the sacraments that in terms of the way we treat, they see them as daily, they see them as yearly and weekly and daily rhythms that they have to participate. And I'll say this, we're all a slack bunch in the Western world. And in fact, I believe if we actually embraced the discipline that Muslims do in their faith, we would truly see a move of God. But we compartmentalize it, and so again, I look at Muslims with absolute respect because they set their religion as the way they live, and it influences every day in their hourly schedules of their lives. In a way, we're often like, well, I did 15 minutes of devotions reading over the coffee on the back porch, that's good. And that's not to critique anyone who does 15 minutes of devotion in the back with coffee, unless it's decaf.
Well, aren't there Muslims that are,
Who are sloppy and lazy like us?
yeah.
Yeah, there are.
I
Yeah.
mean, not.
Yes, but you know what? Every year when they have Ramadan and you see all those Muslims gathering in Mecca, like, we don't have anything of even close comparison. The amount of stuff they put up with and they do, the amount of sacrifice they make on a daily schedule for those who are devout. And I'll say this, as a Christian educator, the way they train their children is second to none. You know, we are in a day and age where we're like, well, I just want my kid to have a good time in church and hope that when they're 20, they'll make a decision to follow Christ. I'll let them choose for themselves. That would never be acceptable in Islam as a whole.
We just came back, we said this before, but we just came back from my brother's old small town. And they have a Catholic school through high school. And it just blew me away Sunday, the families in there with 5, 6 kids. And many teenage kids there by themselves.
Yeah.
That nobody was bringing in.
Well, and
they take care of their parents.
And yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, it happens in pockets as well. So, so experiences, you have the 5 pillars defining what they do. Sacrifices, we talked about that, the black stone coming from the sky, setting the stage for that. These are the categories that we talked about the first week. Sacraments, I believe that these 5 pillars are their sacramental activities. That's how they see it. There isn't the same way that they're taking communion like we are in that same sense. So these are the things, in other words, we expect people, if you're a Christian, you're baptized and you're taking communion. If you're a Muslim, you're participating in these things. It's not an exception. Their sacred spaces are Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem. Sacred time is absolutely an aspect for them because 5 times a day they pray. Everything about their day is centered around that devotion.
Do they have a Sabbath?
Yes, they do. On Fridays, they consider the Friday the holiest day of the week, and that's where they have the prayers are communal on that day rather than individual. And so they gather together in the same way we do with the Sabbath. It's encouraged to enjoy, feast that day. So it's very much like a Sabbath. It's gathering together in community, but it's Friday. So they have Friday, Jews have Saturday, we have Sunday. Finishing out the sacred word, we talked about that. And remember, this is what I did want to say, and I never came back to this. Maybe the Qumran is how that was dictated was the angel communicated with Muhammad, and Muhammad memorized essentially. Because Muhammad was, I think I read somewhere that he was not really literate, so he's not scribing that, but he dictated to others and they wrote it down, or because Qumran actually means recitation, but it is considered the verbatim word of God. In the same way Protestantism holds the scriptures as they do that same thing with this, but that it was a very serious endeavor to pass this down by oral tradition until it was finally written down. I don't remember, I might have that written down here somewhere. I don't know, I'll come back to that if I find it. And the last things, they have Ramadan's their big festival, and they have 2 other ones. I don't know, it's not really worth going into, so. And I don't know when the date is. I think that's all I have.
Jason,
That's a lot.
Is there subjugation of women come from the Quran, or is that just a culture thing?
I would say both, in the same way Western patriarchy has existed. So, I mean, let's not forget, although we are very much comfortable with the equality between men and women in our current day and age, you could go back 70 years and there'd be a whole generation of people who would not accept that. And in fact, you go back to 150 years or back to the turn of the 19th century, and and here's the thing is and that gender roles or sex roles, those things change throughout time in history. I mean, you look back to the period of Laura Ingalls Wilder, and women and men had very different roles, but they were both looked at equally as contributors to the home. Whereas there was a period where that stopped in the last century. And the domestication of women meant a belittling of what their role was, because as machinery and technology came into play, their need, when no longer your job is to wash the clothing as a part of the role that women had in that era, you have a machine that does it, and that leaves leisure time for women. So all sorts of roles and values and how I understand our contribution to society has changed over the last century.
I was told,
Nice and loud.
I was told to ask a Muslim this if I wanted to talk to a Muslim about Christianity. And I think you answered the question, because they told me, and I asked this taxi driver, so if Jesus was so great, but your number one problem with people is that we would equate ourselves with God, that's what Jesus did. He said he was God, so how come you like him so much as a prophet? And he said to me, he was ready for it, he said something really weird to me, and he said, well, we're all kind of gods. Okay, that's what happened to me, is that
I don't know about that
eliminate
statement.
Jesus. They saw Jesus not as a liar, how either he was
Yes,
God or he was.
But their gospel is different than ours. So you have to, and I don't know what their gospel says, but it was notably qualified as being different than ours, and it's INGIL, Angel. So yes, their view of Jesus, their narrative of the gospel is as a prophet, not as a deity.
Does Ishmael have anything to do? Why have I always thought Ishmael had something to do with Islam?
That is where Islam traces its roots. That's why it's called an Abrahamic religion, because he carries the seed of Abraham in the same way Isaac does.
Yeah, I've been told that Abraham, to the Islam, Abraham was to sacrifice Ishmael.
Again, all of those texts, and that would be located in their Tawrat, their version of the Torah. But all of those books have have a different framing or a different narrative. I mean, it's similar narrative. So the differences in an Islamic view of those narratives and our view of those narratives come from the fact that their narratives are, their sacred texts around those stories are different.
Thank you.
Al?
Jason, one of the questions that always intrigued me about the clergy, let's call it Christianic clergy and Islamic clergy, that they have powers to issue orders like fatwas, which is an order to either take revenge, commit murder. I've never seen a bishop, priest, or anything in any church raise their hand and say, we're gonna go out and do this today in revenge or whatever. How do they get by with that and explain that? I know it gets in.
We burn women for being thought to be witches at the stake. In fact,
Yeah, but they're still issuing fatwas.
well, I don't,
You see that all the time on the news. You don't hear them saying, we're gonna go burn witches again.
I mean, Christianity has spread to this, and my best answer to that, again, I'm not a Muslim expert whatsoever, but my answer to that would be world religions, or these religions, seed themselves in different cultures. And as much as...
That would point that their culture's a little more, I think, radical than ours.
Well, probably.
They can do that.
I think the Western world in general has an ethic of egalitarianism that has grown from Europe and expanded to the US. But that's not an ethic that extends to most other nations. I mean, you have a caste system in India. You have extreme, you essentially the feudal system in how many different African nations. I mean, in any other non-Western world, you have a greater, I mean, you don't even want to go to Mexico, because unless you have cash in your pocket to get through, in other words, there are cultural systems that surround those are flavors of the culture that have bled into the religion, or maybe vice versa. I mean, in other words, these are all living, breathing things, which is to say, you know what? Christianity in the South does not look the same as Christianity in New England. Or on the West. Presbyterianism doesn't look the same on the East Coast as it does on the West Coast. The church in Montrose doesn't know their way around a book of order. They don't even want to be Presbyterian. Whereas churches in the East Coast are through and through Presbyterian and take pride in that aspect. I'm probably the weird Presbyterian pastor that does take pride in this area of being a Presbyterian. But my point in saying that is, we live in a day and age where there's such cultural diversity and ecclesial and doctrinal diversity. And in many cases, people don't even really know what they believe. They know what they're kind of against. They don't even have an affirming statement of their own doctrines. If I handed everyone a piece of paper in this room and said, tell me what you believe, hopefully you would just write down the Apostles' Creed and hand it back to me with a wink. But if you ask most Christians in our country what they believe, and they had to write down their faith statement or what they believe, they couldn't articulate it to save their lives. North, south, east, or west. So, I mean, and the same is true probably for lots of Islam, and I would say but the difference, and the thing that I want you to grasp though about that, is they are a proselytizing religion. There is the sense of spreading, but the original intent was to spread God's peace, the praise of God, the care for others, and the concept that there's a last judgment that we'll be judged by. Like the goal of Islam is not to make the world an ugly place and to blow up stuff. It is to make the world a better place and to praise God. And does not mean every Muslim you come into is going to share that sentiment, but just every Christian you come into isn't going to share the same sentiments you do around the gospel either.
I've known some Muslims, and they were extremely peaceful, and they would tell you their beliefs were very, very peaceful and be kind and loving, and they were not into hatred and stuff at all.
And that's just the way, I mean, and I think that we have to keep that open-mindedness. Now, next week, as we talk about Hinduism, that's a totally different system. Again, they're not proselytizing, but they're actually way more open to us. Okay, last question.
Would a Muslim say that the Islamic religion is the evolution of Judaism through Christianity to Muhammad,
Yes,
and this is an evolution.
yes.
And we as Christians missed,
In the same way we look at the Jews, Muslims are looking at us.
yes.
That's the progressive part, yes.
So that's very helpful to me to be able to relate to them.
I mean, they're pulling the same move that we did as Christians. It's from the same playbook.
That's right, that's what I'm saying.
But there's such a big difference in how they look at Jesus Christ and how we look at Jesus
Yes.
Christ.
Well, of course.
There's a huge difference.
There's a huge difference in how the Jews look at Jesus Christ than we look at
Right,
Christ.
But you can't equate them. We're
I'm-
in the age of grace, not works. They're in works.
Well, but there's a lot of Roman Catholics who
Well, that
still.
doesn't matter.
But
There are a lot of people who don't practice their religion like God. I mean, it's a religion, but we're in the age of grace, not of works. They're in the age of works. That's all works.
no, it's
But
not. I
think
mean,
I think they're, everyone, Presbyterians, Catholics, whatever, there are some people that believe in the work still. They may talk about grace, but deep down,
Well, that doesn't
they're
mean
going
they're
to church
practicing
and
it.
they're.
yeah, I agree. And not just Roman Catholics, whether you admit it or not, we all have a sense of doing good, doing bad, and how that fares with God.
But that's not the same.
Well, I know, but you can't criticize them for not sharing the same doctrine that you do.
Yes, I can.
Well, no, you can't. Because then they're justified to criticize us for the same reason.
I don't care. To me,
Well, then you can, but going back to the first meeting that we had, then then you're not in trying to embrace what they believe as they believe it, you're judging it from the platform of Christianity.
Right.
right, and that's the way my life is spent. I mean,
That's a
why do we try to convert them? I mean, why
Generally,
do I
we
have
don't.
missionary
I mean-
friends that are going to the Muslims? You would say just let them live like they're living. I don't think so. They're gonna go to hell.
Well, I think the same way they would want to share with us their truth of Allah, we want to share our truth with them.
Yeah, I mean, do we believe they're gonna go to hell or don't we believe they're gonna? go to hell?
I don't judge anyone to go to hell or to heaven. That's
Well,
God's
read
job.
your Bible.
I do.
So Jason, really, where did the 70?
I'm gonna stop this recording now. And we'll end it for today.